He was my hero, the only one who was always on my side. Until one day, at the holiday dinner table, he started telling all my secrets, one after another. Growing up, my brother was everything I wished I could be. 2 years older, confident, popular at school, the kind of guy who could walk into any room and own it. While I was the awkward younger kid who got picked on for being too quiet, too sensitive, too different. But none of that mattered when I was with him. He made me feel like I belonged somewhere. When I was 12 and came home with a black eye because some kids at school decided I was an easy target, he didn't ask questions. He just walked me to the bathroom, helped me clean up, and told me he'd handle it. The next day, those same kids avoided me completely. I never found out what he said or did, but they never bothered me again. When our parents went through their messy divorce when I was 14, the house became a war zone. Mom would scream at Dad about money, Dad would slam doors and disappear for days, and I'd hide in my room with my headphones on, trying to block it all out. But my brother would always find me. He'd sit on my bed and we'd play video games until 3 in the morning, not talking about the chaos downstairs, just existing in our own little bubble where everything was okay. He taught me how to drive in his beat-up Honda Civic, even though he wasn't supposed to. We'd sneak out on Saturday mornings when our parents were still sleeping off their hangovers from Friday night fights. He'd take me to empty parking lots and let me practice parallel parking between orange cones he'd stolen from a construction site. When I finally got my license, he was more excited than I was. College separated us physically, but somehow we got closer. He'd call me every Sunday night, no matter what party he was missing or what girl he was supposed to be meeting. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. He'd tell me about his classes, his friends, his latest girlfriend. I'd complain about my roommate who never showered and my professors who seemed to hate me personally. But more than that, he became my safe harbor for all the stuff I couldn't tell anyone else. When I was 19 and realized I wasn't as straight as I'd always assumed, he was the first person I told. I was terrified, shaking as I stumbled through the words over a crackling phone connection. He just listened, then said he was proud of me for figuring it out. No big speech, no awkwardness, just acceptance. When the depression hit during my junior year, crushing and relentless like nothing I'd ever experienced before, I called him at 2 in the morning crying so hard I could barely speak. He stayed on the phone with me for 4 hours, talking me through the worst of it. He didn't try to fix me or give me empty platitudes about how things would get better. He just stayed with me in the darkness until the sun came up and I felt like I could breathe again. After college, when I moved back home to save money and figure out my life, he was the only one who didn't make me feel like a failure. Our parents had their opinions about my choices, their subtle hints about when I was going to get serious about my career, find a nice girl, settle down. But he'd just roll his eyes when they started their lectures and change the subject to something ridiculous, like whether hot dogs were sandwiches or why pineapple on pizza was a crime against humanity. When I started dating someone seriously for the first time, a guy I'd met through a friend of a friend, my brother was genuinely excited for me. He wanted to know everything, not in a nosy way, but like he was invested in my happiness. When things got complicated with the relationship, when we'd fight about stupid things that felt enormous at the time, he'd listen to me vent without judgment. He never told me what I should do, just helped me work through my own thoughts until I could see clearly again. The relationship ended messily after 8 months. I thought we had a future together, had started imagining introducing him to the family eventually, maybe even moving in together. But he decided he wasn't ready for something serious, wasn't ready to be out to his own family, wasn't ready for a lot of things. The breakup hit me harder than I expected. I spent weeks feeling like I'd been gutted, questioning everything about myself and what I wanted. Through all of it, my brother was there. He'd show up at my apartment with terrible takeout food and we'd watch mindless action movies until I forgot to be sad for a few hours. He never said anything bad about my ex, never tried to convince me I was better off without him. He just let me be miserable until I was ready not to be anymore. That's why what happened at Thanksgiving felt like such a betrayal. It wasn't just what he did, it was that he was the last person in the world I expected to do it. The whole extended family was there, which hadn't happened in years. Both sets of grandparents, our aunts and uncles, all the cousins. Our mom had been planning it for months, turning it into this big reunion thing. She'd been stressed for weeks, cleaning the house obsessively, planning menus, making sure everyone had somewhere to sleep. The day itself was chaos in the best way. Kids running around everywhere, football on 3 different TVs, the kitchen constantly full of people cooking and snacking and arguing about whether the turkey was done yet. It felt like the kind of family gathering you see in movies, warm and loud and full of life. My brother seemed off all day, but I couldn't put my finger on why. He was quieter than usual, drinking more than normal, not really engaging in conversations the way he usually did. When I asked if he was okay, he just shrugged and said he was tired from work. I figured he was just overwhelmed by all the people and noise. After dinner, we were all sprawled around the living room, that comfortable food coma setting in. The older relatives were telling embarrassing stories about us as kids, the way they always did. Harmless stuff. The time I got my head stuck in the porch railing when I was 5, the Christmas when my brother tried to stay awake all night to catch Santa and fell asleep under the tree instead. Then something shifted. My brother stood up, swaying slightly, and I realized he was drunker than I'd thought. He had this weird smile on his face, like he was about to tell a joke that only he found funny. And then he started talking. He began with seemingly innocent observations about how I'd been different lately, quieter, more secretive. The room was still laughing along, thinking he was building up to some funny story. But then he started getting more specific. He mentioned how I'd been crying a lot recently, how I'd been having trouble sleeping, how I'd been seeing someone but had been really secretive about it. I felt my stomach drop. I tried to catch his eye, to signal him to stop, but he wouldn't look at me. He kept talking, his voice getting louder and more animated, like he was performing for an audience. Then came the first real bomb. He told everyone about my breakup, how devastated I'd been, how I'd called him sobbing multiple times. He described it like it was hilarious, like my pain was entertainment. The room got quieter, people exchanging glances, not sure if they should keep laughing. But he wasn't done. Not even close. He started talking about my dating life, about how I'd been so secretive about this mysterious person I'd been seeing. He built it up like a big reveal, asking the room if they wanted to know the real reason I'd been so cagey about relationships. And then he said it. Just like that, casual as anything, he told my entire extended family that I was gay, that I'd been dating a guy, that I'd been hiding it from everyone for years. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience, watching this nightmare unfold from somewhere outside myself. My grandmother's face went completely blank. My uncle shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My youngest cousin asked what gay meant, and nobody answered her. But my brother still wasn't finished. Maybe he sensed he'd crossed a line, or maybe he was just too drunk to stop, but he kept going. He started talking about my depression, about the nights I'd called him in crisis, about how I'd been struggling with my mental health for years. He made it sound like I was completely unstable, like I was falling apart constantly, and he was the only thing holding me together. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to run out of the room, out of the house, maybe out of the state. But I was frozen, pinned to my chair by the weight of everyone's stares and the complete shock of what was happening. When he finally sat down, the room stayed quiet for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds. Then people started talking again, but not to me. They talked around me, over me, like I wasn't there. Someone changed the subject to the weather. Someone else started clearing dishes. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, where I sat on the edge of the bathtub and tried to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking. I felt like I might throw up. Everything I trusted him with, every vulnerable moment I'd shared, he just turned into a joke for our family's entertainment. When I came out, he was waiting in the hallway. He looked sober now, like the magnitude of what he'd done was finally hitting him. He started to say something, but I walked past him without a word. Update 1. I couldn't stay in that house another minute after what happened. I grabbed my keys and left without saying goodbye to anyone. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. Texts from various family members, missed calls from my parents, a long voicemail from my grandmother that I couldn't bring myself to listen to. But nothing from him. Not a single message. I drove around for hours that night, not really going anywhere, just needing to move. I ended up at a 24-hour diner on the other side of town, sitting in a booth by myself at 2 a.m., drinking terrible coffee and trying to figure out what my life looked like now that my biggest secret was out. The worst part wasn't even that everyone knew, though that was terrifying in its own way. It was that he'd weaponized my trust. Every vulnerable conversation we'd ever had, every moment when I needed him most, he'd apparently filed away to use against me someday. When I finally went home the next morning, there were 17 missed calls and 43 text messages waiting for me. Most were from my parents, alternating between concern and confusion. A few were from cousins and aunts, awkward messages trying to be supportive but clearly not knowing what to say. My grandmother had sent a text that just said, "We need to talk," which filled me with dread. But still nothing from my brother. I spent the weekend hiding in my apartment, ignoring most of the calls and messages. I wasn't ready to have conversations about my sexuality with relatives who'd found out about it in the worst possible way. I wasn't ready to explain my depression to people who now thought they understood something fundamental about me based on a drunk person's cruel summary. On Sunday, my parents showed up at my door. They looked tired and worried, like they'd been up all night trying to figure out how to handle this situation. We sat in my living room, and they asked me questions I'd never planned to answer to them. Not like this, anyway. They wanted to know if I was okay, if I needed help, if there was anything they could do. They were trying to be supportive, but there was this underlying tension, like they were walking on eggshells around me. My dad kept saying he wished I'd felt comfortable telling them myself, and I could hear the hurt in his voice that I hadn't trusted them enough. The conversation was exhausting. They meant well, but having to explain your entire identity and mental health struggles to your parents in one sitting because someone else forced your hand is not exactly ideal circumstances for that kind of discussion. They also told me that my brother had left town. Apparently, he'd packed a bag Saturday morning and driven back to his place 2 states away without talking to anyone. My mom seemed to think this was evidence that he felt bad about what he'd done, but I wasn't ready to give him credit for feeling guilty. Over the next few days, other family members started reaching out individually. Some of the conversations were surprisingly okay. My younger cousin sent me a sweet message saying she didn't care who I dated as long as I was happy. One of my uncles called to tell me he'd suspected for years and just wanted me to know he loved me regardless. But others were harder. My grandmother's phone call was a disaster. She spent an hour telling me about her concerns for my soul and asking if I'd considered therapy to fix this problem. She meant well, I think, but it was brutal to sit through. The whole experience made me realize how much I'd relied on my brother as a buffer between me and the rest of the family. He'd always been the one to deflect their more intrusive questions, to change the subject when conversations got uncomfortable, to run interference when I needed space. Now he was gone, and I was dealing with all of their reactions completely alone. A week after Thanksgiving, he finally called me. I was at work, and his name appearing on my phone screen made my stomach drop. I let it go to voicemail. He called again an hour later. Then again that evening. I listened to the voicemail eventually. His voice sounded small and tired, nothing like the confident person who'd stood up in my parents' living room and shredded my privacy. He said he knew he'd screwed up, that he was sorry, that he wanted to explain what had happened. He said he'd been going through some stuff and had handled it badly, but that he never meant to hurt me like that. I deleted the message without calling him back. The thing that kept eating at me was trying to understand why he'd done it. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment mistake. He'd systematically gone through years of private conversations and turned them into public humiliation. That takes a certain kind of cruelty that I'd never seen in him before. I started replaying interactions from the past few months, looking for clues I'd missed. Had he been resentful about something? Had I been taking advantage of his support without realizing it? Had he been building up anger about being my confidant and I'd just been oblivious? The more I thought about it, the more I realized there had been signs. Little comments here and there about how I always seemed to be dealing with some crisis. Questions about when I was going to get my life together that felt more pointed than concerned. A certain weariness in his voice sometimes when I called upset about something. But even if he'd been feeling burdened by our relationship, what he'd done was unforgivable. There were 1,000 ways he could have talked to me about needing boundaries or space that didn't involve betraying every confidence I'd ever shared with him. Update 2. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, my brother showed up at my apartment unannounced. I was making dinner when I heard the knock, and when I opened the door, there he was, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He was holding a bag from my favorite Thai restaurant, like food was going to somehow fix what he'd broken. I didn't invite him in, but he started talking anyway, right there in my doorway. He said he'd been trying to work up the courage to face me, that he knew a phone call wasn't enough, that he needed to explain himself in person. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face, but a bigger part needed to understand what had happened. So I let him in, not because I forgave him, but because I needed answers. He sat on my couch, still holding that bag of food like a peace offering, and started talking. What came out was not what I expected. Apparently, he'd been struggling with his own stuff for months, problems at work, a relationship that had fallen apart, financial stress he hadn't told anyone about. But more than that, he'd been watching me go through my breakup and my depression, and it had triggered something in him about his own mental health that he'd been ignoring for years. He said that being my support system had become overwhelming, not because he didn't care about me, but because he was drowning in his own problems and didn't know how to ask for help. Every time I called him in crisis, he'd push down his own feelings to be there for me, and the resentment had been building without him realizing it. Then, at Thanksgiving, he'd been drinking and feeling sorry for himself, watching our whole family interact like everything was normal while he felt like he was falling apart inside. When they started talking about family secrets and embarrassing stories, something in him snapped. He said it felt like everyone was pretending to be perfect when nobody actually was, and he wanted to expose that somehow. But instead of talking about his own struggles, he'd taken mine and thrown them out there instead. He said he realized immediately that he'd made a terrible mistake, but by then it was too late to take any of it back. The explanation helped me understand what had happened, but it didn't make it okay. I told him that I got that he was going through his own stuff, but that didn't give him the right to betray my trust like that. I said that if he'd needed space or boundaries, he should have talked to me, not ambush me in front of our entire family. He cried, which I'd never seen him do as an adult. He kept saying he was sorry, that he knew he'd destroyed something between us that might never be fixable, that he hated himself for what he'd done. He said he'd been going to therapy since Thanksgiving, trying to figure out how he'd gotten to a place where he could hurt someone he loved so much. I felt bad for him, which made me angry at myself. I didn't want to feel bad for the person who'd humiliated me and violated my privacy. But seeing him break down like that, it was clear he was genuinely devastated by what he'd done. We talked for 3 hours that night. He told me about the therapy he'd started, about how he was learning to deal with his own mental health instead of ignoring it until it exploded. He told me about the apology letters he'd written to various family members, taking responsibility for putting them in an uncomfortable position and explaining that his behavior had nothing to do with me and everything to do with his own problems. I told him about the past few weeks, about having to come out to our entire extended family in damage control mode, about the conversations I'd had to have that I'd never wanted to have. I told him about how isolated I'd felt without him as my ally, but also how angry I was that I'd ever needed him to be that buffer in the first place. By the end of the conversation, I was emotionally exhausted. I didn't forgive him. I wasn't ready for that, but I understood better what had happened and why. He asked if there was any chance we could rebuild what we'd had, and I told him honestly that I didn't know. After he left, I felt more confused than ever. Part of me missed having him in my life, missed having someone who knew all my history and understood my family dynamics. But I also didn't know if I could ever trust him with vulnerable information again. Over the next few weeks, he kept reaching out, but not in the pushy way I'd expected. He'd send occasional texts checking in, but he didn't demand responses. He sent me articles he thought I'd find interesting, memes that reminded him of inside jokes we used to share, little gestures that felt like him trying to remind me of who we used to be together. The hardest part was that I could see he was actually working on himself. He started seeing a therapist regularly, not just as a response to what he'd done, but as something he genuinely needed. He reached out to other family members to apologize for the scene he'd caused. He started being more open about his own struggles instead of always being the strong one who had everything figured out. But every time I started to soften toward him, I'd remember the feeling of sitting in that living room while he systematically destroyed my privacy, and the anger would come flooding back. The breaking point came 2 months after Thanksgiving. I was having a particularly bad day. Work stress, family drama, the kind of day when everything feels overwhelming and you just need someone to understand. Without thinking, I picked up my phone to call him, the way I had for years whenever life got too much. But then I stopped myself, because I realized that even though I missed having him to talk to, I couldn't trust him with that kind of vulnerability anymore. And that realization broke something in me that I hadn't even known was still intact. I called him that night, not to pour out my problems, but to tell him what I'd realized. I said that I missed him, that I could see he was trying to make amends, but that something fundamental had changed between us that I didn't think could be fixed. He listened without trying to argue or convince me otherwise. When I was done talking, he said he understood, and that he was sorry not just for what he'd done, but for what we'd lost because of it. Final update. It's been 6 months since Thanksgiving now, and things have settled into a new normal that I never expected. My brother and I aren't the same as we used to be. We probably never will be. But we've found a different way to be in each other's lives. We talk maybe once a week, surface-level conversations about work and weather and what we're watching on Netflix. It feels formal compared to how we used to communicate, but it's something. He doesn't push for more, and I appreciate that he's respecting the boundaries I've had to set. The family situation has evolved too, in ways that surprised me. Having my sexuality out in the open, even though it happened in the worst possible way, has actually been a relief in some respects. I don't have to carefully edit my stories anymore or avoid mentioning dating. Most of my relatives have adjusted better than I expected, and the ones who haven't have at least learned to keep their opinions to themselves. My grandmother and I had several more difficult conversations, but eventually we reached a place where we agreed to disagree about some things while still loving each other. She still prays for me, she told me, but she stopped trying to fix me, which feels like progress. The whole experience taught me that I'd been using my brother as a crutch in ways I hadn't realized. Having him as my primary emotional support meant I'd never really learned to build a broader network of people I could trust. Losing that safety net forced me to reach out to friends more, to be more open with people I cared about, to stop putting all my emotional eggs in one basket. I started seeing a counselor myself, not because I was in crisis, but because I realized I needed to process what had happened and figure out how to trust people again. It's been helpful in ways I didn't expect, giving me tools for dealing with my family dynamics and my own mental health that don't rely on one person being my lifeline. My brother kept going to therapy too. He's been more open about his own struggles, which has actually helped other family members understand what happened that night. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it's created space for more honest conversations about mental health in our family that probably needed to happen anyway. The weirdest thing is that sometimes I'm almost grateful for what happened, which feels wrong to admit. Not grateful for the betrayal or the humiliation, but grateful for being forced out of a dynamic that wasn't healthy for either of us. I was too dependent on him, and he was carrying too much of my emotional weight without either of us acknowledging it. We've both grown up in ways we probably needed to, just not the way we would have chosen. Last month, he sent me a card on my birthday, not a text or a phone call, but an actual card in the mail. Inside, he'd written a simple message about hoping I was doing well and that he was proud of how I'd handled everything over the past few months. It made me cry, but in a good way. I'm not sure we'll ever be as close as we used to be. There's always going to be a part of me that remembers what it felt like to have my trust completely shattered by the person I trusted most. But we're building something new, something more honest and less codependent, and maybe that's actually better than what we had before. The hardest lesson I've learned is that people can love you and still hurt you in unforgivable ways. That doesn't make the love less real, but it also doesn't make the hurt less valid. Sometimes the people who know us best are the ones who can wound us most deeply, not because they're evil, but because they're human and flawed and carrying their own pain that sometimes spills over onto ours. I don't know what our relationship will look like in 5 years or 10 years. Maybe we'll find our way back to being close. Maybe we'll always keep each other at arm's length. But for the first time since Thanksgiving, I'm okay with not knowing. I'm okay with taking it one conversation at a time and seeing what we can build from the pieces of what we used to have. He's not my hero anymore. I don't need him to be. But he's still my brother, and despite everything, that still means something. Just something different than it used to.